Hello, my name is Charles Sabo, and I am going to begin this webinar. First of all, I want to pull up the visual aid. I am a 5-time published author. I have written the book of Revelation of Jesus Christ. It's my 7th book. I've got one that's not published, that's sitting and waiting. And then this one will be shortly finished too. I'm currently finishing chapter 17 and beginning chapter 17 tonight if I have time. And I'll just keep rolling with it. Tonight is an introduction. Going to be 23 sessions in 23 days. I want to get through this so that people can have an understanding, because we seem to be in some difficult times right now. Many people are interested in knowing what we have in front of us as the church, as well as what the people that get left behind, what they have in store for them as well. And so I'm going to start out with an introduction tonight. It's about 1 hour, and it'll just pertain to going into the book, have an understanding of the background of the book, as well as what it entails. So as you see on your visual aid, it's the beginning of writing the book. You come up with your title page and what have you. And so we're going through right through my PDF of what I've written so far. There's a preface of who I am. I'm not going to go through that. You can see I've got the chapters labeled and named and page numbers already in the book. We're all the way down to chapter 16, finishing that up. I'll be in 17 within a couple of verses. But we're going to go over the introduction so that you have a better understanding. And when we get finished with these 23 sessions, I may expedite the publishing of this book as things come to an end, and some people will maybe want to buy it or whatever. I'll make it available. So I'm just going to read what I've written and stop and make comments, but we'll just keep going from there. Since this is a recording, I don't have anybody physically in the class to ask questions, but as the webinar becomes popular, I hope to have some people. The book of Revelation is better called the book of the revelation of Jesus Christ. In many instances, I refer to this book as the book of Revelation in order to abbreviate what I'm writing or saying. It was written by the Apostle John, who was one of the original 12 disciples of Jesus Christ and the youngest of the 12. John had written the Gospel of John, as well as the 3 epistles known as 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. It's argued that the 3 epistles were written between AD 85 and AD 100, while it was also argued that the Gospel of John may have been written slightly after those epistles, between AD 90 and AD 100. I'm not totally firm on that myself, so I just want to show you what the popular belief is. John and his brother James were born in Bethsaida and unto his parents Zebedee and Salome. He was a Galilean fisherman, as business partners with his brother James and also with Simon Peter, one of the other disciples and apostles. It seemed to have been a successful business because they had servants in their homes. You can confirm that in Mark 16:20. John and Andrew, Peter's brother, were both disciples first of John the Baptist, which you can see in John 1:32 through 37. It seems that John was well enough connected with the community that he knew the high priest as well as Nicodemus. John was one of 3 who were of the inner circle of Jesus. John, his brother, James, and Peter were taken by Jesus to experience the transfiguration, the raising of Jairus' daughter, the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, and then in Gethsemane. John was also assigned care of Jesus' mother, Mary, rather than any of Jesus' siblings birthed by Mary. Domitian, emperor of Rome, had sentenced the Apostle John to Patmos in AD 90. Late 1st century and 2nd century disciples Irenaeus, Clement, and Eusebius had testified that John had returned to Ephesus after the death of Domitian, who died September 9th of AD 96. With the testimonies of the three, it seems that the Apostle John had written the book of Revelation of Jesus Christ between AD 94 and September of AD 96. John had returned to Ephesus after his release from Patmos in order to appoint church leadership and set things in order. It is believed that he died of old age in Ephesus around age 98. John spent 2 years on the island of Patmos as a prisoner of Rome. The island of Patmos is a small volcanic island which sits in the Aegean Sea, about 60 kilometers or 37 miles from the Turkish coastal city of Miletus. First century Patmos, with its natural protective harbor, was a strategic island on the sea lane from Ephesus to Rome. Contrary to belief, Patmos consisted of a large administrative center, outlying villages, a hippodrome for horse racing, and 3 or more pagan temples. So you can see there's an overhead view via airplane, as well as here, maybe helicopter there. Though there are 4 divisions of views of the book of Revelation on the intent of the author for his readers, there is really only one that can be supported with a truly contextual biblical interpretation. The 4 views are the preterist view, which was only pertaining to the time it was written; the historical view, which is only a historical context of the past; idealists totally believe that it's all allegorical; and then the futurists, which believe that the book is prophetic. I will not explain the other 3 views, but will reveal the futurist view, which confirms the biblical prophecies and their correlation with the rest of the scriptures. One position, which I will state, is that the first 3 views will fall into an amillennial view towards the millennial kingdom described in Revelation 20. The futurist view is the only view that will believe in a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ upon the earth, which is known as premillennialism. Though there is much allegory within the book of Revelation, there are many prophecies that must be interpreted as literal. Being an expert in eschatology, I will explain through the biblical commentary what is literal and what is allegorical. The prophetic value of the book of Revelation overwhelmingly coincides with many prophecies of the Old and New Testament. In the Old Testament, there are 1,847 references to the kingdom of Christ. In the 216 chapters of the New Testament, there are 318 references to the second coming of Christ. And then, with such tremendous recognition of the coming of Messiah, for every 1 reference towards Christ's first coming, there are 8 references towards his second coming. The study of Christ, whether it be of the first or second coming, is known as Christology. Since he has already visited the earth for this first advent, this is now a study of the past, future, and future events of Christ. The study of Bible prophecy, whether it be from the past or present or future, is called eschatology. Now, in deciphering the prophetic text of the book of Revelation, one must be willing to understand the Old Testament and the prophetic promises by God to his patriarchs and his prophets. Understanding the promises to Israel and King David, which is the Davidic covenant, concerning Israel's future and the throne of David, should cause a concern towards the first 3 views mentioned above. If the book of Revelation was fulfilled in the past or is historical, then God will have lied to the patriarchs and prophets concerning Israel's future. There are many prophecies concerning the millennial kingdom of Christ within the book of Isaiah, Joel, Zephaniah, Zechariah, as well as Ezekiel and Daniel. The allegorical view would deny that Christ was coming to rule on the earth as 1,000 years. That's Revelation 20, verse 2 through 7, which is absolutely contradictory to hundreds of millennial kingdom references in the Old Testament. The most important point to realize when attempting to understand the book of Revelation is to realize that the 22 chapters can be divided into 3 segments. Okay? From the time Jesus had commanded John to write what he had seen, and the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. From that time, Jesus commanded John. The timeline was divided between past and present. The past was behind John within verses 1 through 18. Within Revelation 1:19 through 3:22, it's to be understood to be written on the current church age. During the time John was given this prophecy, and ends at the completion of 2,000 years of the church age. So Revelation 1:19 through 3:22 is the entire 2,000 years of church age. Chapters 4 through 9, during the time that the 7-year 70th week of Daniel begins, it's 4 through 19 are during the time that the 70th week of Daniel begins, and the ends of Revelation 19. I'm getting distracted between trying to highlight it and actually say it and read it. When Christ comes back to the earth is when the 70-week prophecy ends. So that's why Revelation 19 brings an end to the 70 week, because that's when Christ returns in Revelation 19. The remaining 3 chapters concern the earth after Christ has returned, consisting of the millennial kingdom of Christ, which is Revelation 20 verses 1 through 10, Judgment Day, which is Revelation 20, 11 through 15, and eternity, which is Revelation 21 and 22, both chapters. To best understand the 7-year 70th week of Daniel, one must study the book of Daniel. The angel Gabriel interrupted Daniel's prayer in Daniel 9, 1 through 23, to bring him one of the most important prophecies of all Scripture. He indicated that he was going to give him skill and understanding of what God was planning, which meant that he was going to giving him all of God's children this understanding. He's giving all of us this, since Daniel was meant to write it down. One can see that God truly loves Daniel, as he always has been true and faithful to him. Gabriel then declared to Daniel concerning the 70 weeks, as one can read beginning in Daniel 9:24. So we're going to go over the 70 weeks prophecy, so you can have a understanding of why the 70th week is so important and what it has to do with the book of Revelation. So we'll read Daniel 9:24. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. For someone to read Daniel 9:24 without having ever seen or heard of it would cause one to be confused and frustrated and understand the meaning. And I know I was the first time I read it. Fortunately, 2,600 years have passed and many have come to an agreement concerning the exact interpretation of the words 70 weeks. Author Thomas Ice brings a great explanation to the meaning of this passage in full. For those acquainted with Hebrew, they will notice that the same word appears twice at the beginning of verse 24. That twice used word is sabuim, meaning 77s. This Hebrew word appears first as plural, 70, sabuim, plural, and followed by a participle form functioning as an adjective, 77s. Well, the sevens is actually plural, my bad. And then the adjective is 70. There's 70 of the sevens, sorry. That this Hebrew phrase should be rendered as 77s is unanimously agreed upon by representatives of all interpretive schools. There is also a great consensus that the 77s refers to years, since this is what Daniel was contemplating in Jeremiah 25:11, 21. Daniel was referring to Jeremiah 25:11 to 12 and 29:10 through 14, as evident in Daniel 9 verse 2 in his prayer to God, which God answered. Thus our Lord has in mind 70 weeks of years, or 490 years. Okay, the 70 weeks prophecy is 77. 70 times 7 is 490. and their years, so 490 years. Thomas Ice mentions also that the word determined in its context is also once in all of the Old Testament, is also used once in the Old Testament. And I investigated this myself and found that he was right. The word determined is translated from the Hebrew word shatak, which means to divide or determine. You can't find this word anywhere else in the Hebrew, in the Old Testament, anywhere. Ice continues to mention that Gabriel was careful to say this word, as God was careful in his dividing of the time. It is important to realize that those 70 weeks are determined for Daniel's people and the holy city. Most of all, this pertains to only Israel, because Israel was guilty of not keeping the 7th year of rest for their land as the Lord had commanded. We're going to stop there. We're going to go down to Leviticus 25:3 and read that. This was in the laws of Moses. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard, gather in the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year you shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, and a Sabbath for the year. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. That is a command from God. Okay, so go back up here. Israel had failed to keep, or go back up right here. If Israel had failed, oops, sorry about that. Israel failed to keep the Sabbath rest of the land 70 times. Therefore, they owed the land 70 years of rest. Therefore, the captivity lasted 70 years to ensure that the land could rest. Also, the time frame of the prophecy equates to 70 Sabbath years multiplied times the 7 years total elapsed between each Sabbath. This equals the time frame that they were guilty of not obeying God and his commandment. So 70 Sabbaths times 7 years equals 77s, because there's 7 years between each Sabbath year. These are Sabbath years. So the Sabbath was the 7th year, but there's 7 years between that Sabbath year. So 70 times that 70 years equals 77s, or 490 years. Now, the remainder of verse 24 points out the purpose of the 490 years in what was to be accomplished. Okay, so Thomas Ice did a pretty good job of breaking this down too. As someone reads Daniel 9:24, they will see 6 items that will be accomplished. Usually when the word of God represents a list, it can be subdivided into smaller groups. Thomas Ice can I help with this. So he believes that many have divided these 6 items into 3 subgroups of 2, but they are best divided into 2 subgroups of 3. And I agree. The first triad has to do with sin, and interestingly, these are the exact words that Daniel used in his prayer in verse 5 of chapter 9. God was speaking to Daniel's prayer through the first 3 goals. The second set of 3 goals for the 490-year period have to do with God's righteousness. Okay, so the first 3 items all pertain to sin, because Israel was being used by God to bring into the world the Messiah. The Messiah was promised to mankind ever since the fall in the Garden of Eden. The Messiah was to atone for the sins of all who would believe. The second 3 items pertain to God's righteousness, concerning how it would be brought to the world, basically, and how he would bring the world his kingdom while he would rule in righteousness. The 6 goals and explanations go as follows. The first one, right here, to finish the transgression, which is the emphasis upon Israel's nation's sins. The rejection of their Messiah will be brought to an end, per Zechariah 12, verse 10. All right. The second, to make an end of sins. And once again, it has to do with Israel. The general nation of Israel will be taken away, the sins of the nation. God will change the heart of stone into a heart of flesh, as per Ezekiel 36 through verse 26. That is when Israel will be converted into believers. There are Messianic Jews now, and always have been, but the nation Israel being blinded from the gospel, will be, well, if you read Zechariah 12:10, God's Spirit will fall upon them and they will become believers, and that'll fulfill Ezekiel 36:26. He'll give them a heart of flesh and replace the heart of stone. To make reconciliation for iniquity, all it means the fellowship and worship of the Lord will be celebrated with an annual feast of tabernacles, as Israel and the world will join him in his feast. Okay, so it's a reconciliation for the iniquity, basically coming to every year to Jerusalem. Everybody will be in celebration of the reconciliation of sin. That's Zechariah 14:16. To bring an everlasting righteousness, as Israel and the remaining mortals have been removed of their sinful ways, everlasting life will be their inheritance for their eternity, and that'll be immortality. That's per Isaiah 32 verse 17. And then to seal up the vision and prophecy. Now, the prophecies and visions made to Israel will come to an end in complete fulfillment. The Davidic covenant of 2 Samuel 7, done. All the prophecies will cease, as it will not be needed anymore, because Jesus Christ, the Lord God, will be on earth and sitting on his throne. Then, to anoint the most holy Jesus, Jesus will sit upon his throne and will be the anointed holy God to all the earth. And you can read of that in Zechariah 14:20-21 as an example, but you can see this everywhere in the Old Testament. Okay, so that's the fulfillment of what you read there in 9:25. We're going to read, know therefore, understand, restore Jerusalem, the temple, going forth, rebuild Jerusalem. Okay, we're going to read this. Know therefore and understand that from going forth of the commandment to restore, to build Jerusalem into the Messiah, the Prince. So here we have a beginning time frame and an ending time frame stated. So going forth, from the going forth to restore to commandment to restore. So let's get that thing out of the way. From the going forth of the commandment to restore. So from this point, and then unto or until Messiah the Prince. There's your two beginning and ending point. Shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So there's your time frame. Beginning to end is going to consist of these 69 weeks. 7 and 62 is 69. All right. The street shall be built again, even in troublous times. Okay. Now, we'll talk about those troublous times. Okay. After the destruction of the first temple, a prophecy of the new temple was revealed to the prophet Daniel. The Messiah was to appear to Israel based on the decree to rebuild the second temple. The decree to rebuild the temple was prophesied by Isaiah when he named King Cyrus as the one who would command the decree. Here it is. Isaiah 44:28. Thus saith Cyrus, or that saith Cyrus, I'm sorry, thus. That saith Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to the temple your foundation shall be laid. Cyrus is saying this. God is speaking, right? If you're reading Isaiah 44, the previous verse and whatever, it's God talking. And that means he's saying something before that. And you can go back there, but I'm going with this decree first. Saith Cyrus, and Cyrus is going to say here, even saying to Jerusalem, he is saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to the temple your foundation shall be laid. So this is the decree that Cyrus is going to say. He says you should be built to Jerusalem, and the temple the foundation shall be laid. He made the decree, And so when Cyrus made a decree, it was for the temple to be built and the foundations laid, Jerusalem to be built. So this decree is the commandment to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. That's the beginning point of the prophecy. So in Daniel 25, the Lord was very specific concerning the timing of his entry into Jerusalem. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem and to Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. All right. So from the time of the command to restore unto the Messiah the Prince. So the Messiah the Prince is coming. 69 weeks of years. 7 weeks and 62 weeks. 69 weeks. Many theologians have rejected Cyrus as the one that gave initial commandment of Daniel 9:25 because it was 560 years from the commandment until the Messiah was to be cut off or crucified, which is in verse 26. This is a difference of 77 Julian calendar years. Many can understand that the 70 years of rest in Jeremiah 29:10 through 14, which Israel had denied the land, did not happen in consecutive years, adding up to the full 490 years. So there might have been a few Sabbaths they did keep, and then they continued to forget or not do it. So it wasn't consecutive 490 years that they were guilty of not fulfilling the Sabbath rest of the land for that year. So one should be able to understand that there may have been a gap between the first 7 weeks and the 62 weeks. So the 49th year and the 50th year, there was a gap. In addition to the obvious that God had meant for a gap between the 69th week and the 70th week, okay? We already know that it's very obvious that since we live almost 2,000 years since the conclusion of the 69th week, and we still have not seen the beginning of the 70th week. So there's already a 2,000-year gap between the 69th and 70th week. So it's obvious there's a gap between the 49th year and the 50th year, the 7th week and the 8th week. All right. Daniel addressed Cyrus in the last verse of Daniel chapter 1 because Daniel continued until the first year that Cyrus made the commandment. This was the same year Gaburu, or Darius the Mede, started to reign as well. Daniel 1 verse 21 states, and Daniel continued even until the first year of King Cyrus. So obviously Daniel is continuing to prophecy and whatever until Daniel makes his decree. The first year of Cyrus was when he made his decree. It is most acceptable for this, since the 70 years was to expire within 3 years of this prophecy, and would be another 91 years until 445 BC, when Artaxerxes would make his commandment. It was Artaxerxes the first in verse 20. Okay, if it was Artaxerxes the first in verse 25, Daniel 9:25, this would make God a liar, since the captivity was only to be 70 years, as per Jeremiah 29:10 through 14, right? Therefore, they needed to be able to go back to rebuild right after the expiration of the 70 years. The Artaxerxes the first command would bring the captivity to last 158 years. The building of the second temple began shortly after the decree by Cyrus. It is very obvious that the reliance on the theory favoring Artaxerxes I to be the one to make the decree to build the temple is out of the question, because God would be made to be a liar. There was a 70-year interim period between the 7th and 8th week of this prophecy. During this time, the Jews were challenged by the surrounding Kuthians and Samaritans, who made it difficult for the construction of the walls and gates of Jerusalem. You can see that in Nehemiah 2, chapter 2 through 4. This troublous time was also burdened with the cleansing of those Jews who had intermarried themselves with estranged wives or non-Israelite women. That's in Ezra 9 and 10, and also Nehemiah 5. God had taken a 70-year timeout until the troublous times were finished. The first 7 weeks of years, 49 years, began in 536 BC, Julian time. Those are 365-day years. It is my belief that it's to be calculated. His time and decree should be determined in BC, before Christ, 536 minus 7 years, 529 BC. If you do your calculations correct with the days of years and times 365 days, and then subtract the days and years minus as 360-day years, you come up with a total which equates to 6.8 years or 7 years. So his decree was made in 529 BC when he started to rule in biblical years and not the Julian calendar years. So if you did this 536 BC minus 49 years, well, comes to 46 BC. You subtract the 7 years, it's actually 479 BC. So the Lord embarked a 70-year timeout from the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel 9:24 through 27. This was the first year of the reign of Ahasuerus, which was 46 BC. So the halt, actually, if you do what I said, 529 BC minus the 49 years, you come out with, what is it? 480, I think, BC. Yeah, 480 BC, then you subtract 70 years, you're at 410 BC. All right. The 410 BC is actually the second year that King Darius II of Persia reigned. Okay. And that was, as per the scriptures, I think I got rid of that here. But anyway, we'll go over this a little bit more. The Lord embarked a 70-year gap, I'm sorry. This was the first year of the reign of King Ahasuerus, which I give you the dates here. Those are Julian calendar dates. The construction of the temple was officially stopped in the year 465 BC. King Artaxerxes I reigned 465, so he stopped the construction 465 BC, even though the 40-year gap had already started in the 46 BC. These are all Julian calendar years, so it had already been happening here in this time frame of Ahasuerus, the 70-year gap, because of the troubling times that were happening. If you remember, there were a lot of troubling times for the Jews during the book of Esther, because King Ahasuerus was Xerxes I, who was married to Esther, and there were a lot of troublous times there. All these things, the burden was during that 70-year gap. Things wouldn't pick up again of the 70-week prophecy until the second year of King Darius II of Persia, which, if you look at it, he started rule in biblical years in 412 BC, which actually was 422 BC in Julian calendar years. So the Jews and the non-believers have really put a monkey wrench into our timing, because they didn't want it to equate to Messiah having been Jesus. So please make note that Bishlam, Mizraddith, Tabeel, and the rest of their companions had waited until King Ahasuerus was dead, Esther's husband, until they wrote his successor, Artaxerxes I. And then from that letter they sent him, they stopped the construction of the temple during his first year. Artaxerxes I's first year is when the temple stopped. But the 70-year timeout had already begun in 46 BC, and then 465 is when the temple stopped being built. So the troublous times included times where they were still working, the troublous times. All right. Didn't want to get you too confused, but I wanted you to know that the 69-week prophecy ended when Jesus rode into Jerusalem. We'll read this here. The Lord not only provided the exact year which Messiah would ride into Jerusalem, but also provided them with the exact day. There was a command from God to celebrate the feast of Passover every year since the time of Moses. God prophesied to Israel to be looking forward to Messiah while celebrating his feast days. The Jews just didn't get it. The feast days were linked to the Messiah. All right, so I'll read Exodus 12:3-6. Speak you unto the congregation of Israel, saying, in the 10th day of the month, they shall take from them every man a lamb according to the house of the fathers, a lamb for a house, and a household to be a little too little for the lamb, let his neighbor next to his house take it to according to the number of souls. Now every man according to eating shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year, right? Blemishless, sin-free as Jesus. And you shall take it out from the sheep and from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of the month, and shall make a holy assembly, make a whole assembly of the congregation of Israel, and shall kill it in the evening. So that lamb dwelled with the family, the host, and then was killed in the evening of the 14th. So from the 10th was when the lamb entered the home and then was killed on the 14th. Well, Jesus was killed as a Passover lamb on the 14th of Nisan. He rode into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday on the 10th of Nisan. So the 10th of Nisan is the day Messiah was to ride into Jerusalem on that fulfillment of the 69 sevens, the 482 years. On that exact day, 10th of Nisan, Messiah rode in. So if you recall, and I'm going to take you real quick to something. Gosh, I thought I had it here. That's too much waiting. Never mind. I'm back. Go back to the reading. If you go into Luke and read of Jesus's re-entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, Jesus will say, he will curse Jerusalem and say, not stone shall be left upon another, the destruction of the temple, because they knew not their time of visitation. They were supposed to know that exact day. The 10th of Nisan was that day. And you can read of it in Zechariah on the foal, how he rides in on the foal of an ass on that day. Okay. And so it's all prophesied for that day. So it came to pass is all you need to know right now for the book of Revelation. So let's see. Where was I? Let's see. We're going to read through here. Daniel was given the prophecy 6 centuries before verse 26 came to pass. Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. So we're going to read this. Verse 26, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off. So, excuse me. So after the time of the 3 segments of time, the 7 weeks and 62 weeks, Daniel was then given down here that after the conclusion of the 62 weeks, after the conclusion of that, which would be when Messiah had entered, shall Messiah be cut off. Well, Messiah was cut off 4 days later. He was crucified on the cross 4 days later. So this just fulfills once again by Jesus. And he was crucified not for himself, but for his people, for the atonement for their sins. So absolute prophetic of the fulfillment of the 70 weeks, the fulfillment of atoning for our sins. But Jerusalem and Israel won't believe it until later. And the people of the prince shall come, the people of the prince that shall come. So there's a prince that's coming. The people of this prince that's coming, the people shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The prince doesn't destroy this city and sanctuary. The people of the prince that shall come. The prince that shall come. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and sanctuary. There's the English on that. Who are the people? They're the people of the prince that shall come. So the prince that shall come is going to be of the same people that destroy the city and the sanctuary. They're the same people. And the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. So there's other devastations coming. So this flood can be read of in Revelation 12, and we'll come to that. But it's an allegorical flood. Let's go here. Daniel was given the prophecy 6 centuries before the verse 26 came to pass. Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. One should look to the past and see Messiah was cut off and was crucified for all believers to atone for their sins. He was crucified in the most brutal of ways, and not for anything he had done, but he did it for his beloved children, of whom he will spend eternity with. The next statement in verse 26 is one that declares the origin of the Antichrist of the 70th week of this prophecy. So this, what's this all have to do with the book of Revelation? Here we are. The second part of verse 26 is the prince that shall come. Well, verse 27 tells you what it has to do with this prince, but the people of the prince destroy. I'll read it. The people of the prince who would be the ones that shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The prince that shall come will be the same people that destroy the city and the sanctuary. In other words, the city and the sanctuary was to be destroyed by the same people that later will bring a descendant to be that Antichrist. In the future, one will know this to be that Antichrist because he can be identified by verse 27. He will be the one who successfully negotiates a covenant between Israel and her enemies, which will start the last week, the 70th week, or 7 years of the 70-week prophecy, right? 70-week prophecy. One should realize that this prophecy of the destruction of the city and the sanctuary has already been fulfilled. Okay, so a people have already destroyed the city and the sanctuary. All right, the sanctuary being the temple. This happened in AD 70 by the Romans. Okay, AD 70, General Titus came upon the Romans and destroyed the city and the sanctuary because the people were rebelling against Rome. That's all. That's in a nutshell. The Jewish people were rebelling against the Romans, and they were defeated and scattered. This was 37 years after Jesus Christ had been crucified. The people of the prince were the Romans, so therefore the prince or Antichrist will be Roman, because the people of the prince destroyed the sanctuary. So the Roman people destroyed the sanctuary. So the people of the prince destroyed the sanctuary. Well, the prince is identified as Antichrist in verse 27. So we'll be coming to that soon. In Luke 21, Jesus was speaking to the Christians and had warned them to flee when they would see the city compassed with armies. Many Christians remembered what Jesus had said and did flee Jerusalem. Flavius Josephus was the famous Jewish historian who wrote of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. He was very thorough in his observation of the events of that time. He makes no notes of any Christians being killed in Jerusalem in his convergence or coverage of the event. This revelation by Jesus concerning the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple confirmed the authenticity of the prophecy in Daniel 9:26. So you can read what Jesus had to say about the destruction of the temple and his ride into Jerusalem in Luke 21, verse 20 through 24. He was very upset that they didn't realize him. They didn't realize he recognized him as the Messiah that was scheduled to be there that day. And so he cursed them and said that the temple would be destroyed because of it. All right. And the Jews have not had a temple ever since, by the way. God has prevented them from performing the heresies of atoning for sin by killing of animals, because he has already atoned for everyone's sins by the killing of his only son. Therefore, Daniel 9:27, one can now identify, let's read Daniel 9:27 first, I'm sorry. There's a pronoun. He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, midst, he shall cause sacrifice and oblation to cease. So he's going to break his covenant. And for the overspreading abomination, he shall make it desolate. And so he's going to commit the abomination of desolation. And even until the consummation, the fulfillment, and that determined shall be poured out upon the desolate, being those that are to be destroyed because of God's wrath. Through Daniel 9:27, one can know the identity of the prince. First or second, actually, forget, I'm going to get rid of that. First beast. And this is just something I had thrown in there years ago when I wrote this particular paragraph. But I've already determined that it cannot be the second beast, because he rises out of the pit of hell, the bottomless pit, at the 1261st day of the 7 years. So it is absolutely the first beast. The identity of the prince as someone who is the initiator of, who is the initiator or negotiator of a 7-year covenant between Israel and her enemies. Some grammatically ignorant people will mistakenly connect the pronoun he in verse 27 to the Messiah in verse 26. If one knows how to use pronouns properly, one needs to connect the pronoun he in verse 27 to the most previous mentioned noun, which is the prince of the people that destroyed the sanctuary. The prince is Antichrist, who will negotiate a covenant with many for 1 week, and the midst shall cease its sacrifice, and the oblation shall cease. That's the Antichrist. Okay, so that's where the abomination of desolation is referred to. You can see it in other places in the Old Testament referred to, as well as in the book of Revelation. All right, so the sentence, he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease, will be the discontinuation of the temple sacrifices, middle of the 7 years, midst. And so if you did your calculations, 360 biblical day years times 7, you come up with 2,520 biblical days of the 7 years. And then the midst would be on day 1260 and 1261, right in the middle of midnight. But the abomination of desolation will happen on day 1261, because it will be given power for 42 months, which is the second half. So you take that first day of the second half as the day of the abomination of desolation. And then we'll explain that a little bit more when you get to Revelation 13. Little preview there. So let's go back to what we're saying here. The sentence, I already did that. Okay. Which the Jews will have been allowed formally by the Antichrist. He will find it necessary to stop the worship of Yahweh, and he will then make demands of everyone to worship him, being the Antichrist, instead, the first beast. The Antichrist, the first beast, will initiate a 7-year, 1-week covenant between Israel and her enemies. This is now known as the 7-year, 70th week of Daniel 9:24 through 27, or otherwise known as the tribulation period. This has also been referred to as the time of Jacob's trouble. Okay, and Isaiah will separate children of Jacob from children of Israel. Children of Jacob are the rebellious ones, the ones that are non-believers. Children of Israel are the believers, the non-rebellious ones, because Jacob was unrighteous and rebellious until he had that wrestling with God in the wilderness and hurt his hip and was named Israel. That was Jacob's or Israel's conversion, and so that's when he was righteous. Just so you know. So a little bit of theology there. Some believe that the church will be pulled out at the midpoint of the 7 years. This is known as the mid-tribulation rapture. The belief that the church will be pulled off of the planet before the 7 years begins is known as the pre-tribulation rapture. I'm sorry. Let me step back. I'm totally misreading this. Rushing here, I get distracted. Some believe the church will be on the earth for the entire 7-year tribulation period until Christ arrives back, or on Revelation 19. This is known as the post-tribulation rapture. Some believe that the church will be pulled out at the midpoint of the 7 years. This is known as the mid-tribulation rapture. The belief that the church will be pulled off the planet before the 7 years begins is known as the pre-tribulation rapture. It will provide evidence, which will support the latter of the three, which is the pre-tribulation rapture. The Bible strongly points to the pre-tribulation rapture, even though many are very ignorant and believe false doctrine. The word revelation has been derived from the Greek word apocalypse, which is defined as a disclosure of truth and instruction concerning things before unknown. So apocalypse does not necessarily mean end of the world, right? Neither does revelation, right? So the definition is a disclosure of truth, instruction concerning things before unknown. So it's unknown what I'm going to eat for dinner tomorrow. So when I figure it out and I disclose it, I'm giving you an apocalypse. Kind of funny. Would you like to know my apocalypse for my dinner? I don't know. It's before unknown. Anyway, this book is a single revelation of Jesus Christ given to the Apostle John when he exiled to the island of Patmos. Therefore, it is incorrect to ever call any of the verses of chapters as a plural in the word revelations, nor referring to the entire book of Revelations as revelations. The Lord Jesus Christ presented visions of one revelation of a time of the 70th week of Daniel, 9:24 through 9:27. One will notice that many judgments and blessings declared in the entire 22 chapters, which link back to the previous prophecies from the former prophets and apostles. The fulfillment, what's wrong with this thing? The fulfillment of the prophecies of God was revealed to the Apostle John through this single 22-chapter book of Revelation. It's one revelation from Jesus. It's not book of Revelations, because it's all one revelation. Okay? And I sometimes make that same mistake. Years and years of maybe calling it that, and I still will be in habit of saying it. It kind of slides off your mouth, and you're like, oh, oops. So tomorrow we're going to be covering chapter 1, just a little preview, and it'll probably be in a recording eventually. But we are done here for this chapter. And so what I'm going to do is get to my video and end it. And then you'll be able to, since I have nobody sitting in right now, Normally I'd have a question and answer period. I will stop during segments and stop and answer questions, because questions will come up as I go through chapter 1 and all the other chapters to follow, and I'll stop and do the question and answer at that point. So for now, I'm just going to say goodbye, and I'll see you for Revelation of Jesus Christ, chapter 1. I can find it right here. You can see I've already got it written. There you go, all of it written. So we'll go with it. God bless. Nani? Yeah. You can eat dinner now. No. Yes, I finished. I just had to redo it a few times. Oh.